When you feel unloved, it's like a silent weight settles on your chest. You carry it around with you, invisible to others but undeniable to you. It's in the quiet moments, when your phone doesn't buzz, when you walk into a room and no one looks up, when your efforts go unnoticed, and your heart feels like it's echoing in an empty cave. And in those moments, there's a dangerous temptation. The temptation is to let that feeling define who you are. You begin to tell yourself stories. I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable. I'm always the one who cares more. And here's where the real damage starts. Because those stories begin to build roots. They grow deeper with every unanswered message, with every disappointment, with every relationship that didn't go the way you hoped. Eventually, you stop questioning the story and start living inside of it. But you have to stop. You have to realize that pain is a visitor. It shows up, sometimes uninvited, sometimes through no fault of your own. But it doesn't have the right to move in and redecorate your soul. Your emotions are powerful signals, not dictators. They're messengers, pointing out wounds, drawing your attention to places that need care. But they are not qualified to write the script of your life. There's a moment, a gap between feeling and meaning. You feel unloved. That's the experience. But then your mind rushes to assign it meaning. If I feel unloved, I must be unlovable. That's the lie. That's the collapse of distinction between pain and truth. And if you let it, that lie will rob you of your voice, your purpose, and your future. What you must do instead is pause. Stand in that emotional storm without flinching and say, I feel unloved right now, that's real. But that doesn't mean I am unloved in totality. And it definitely doesn't mean I'm unworthy of love. You separate the experience from your identity. That one move, right there, is a kind of psychological jiu-jitsu. You let the weight come, but you don't let it crush you. You hold it in your hands and examine it like an object, not like a sentence handed down by a judge. There's a kind of strength in doing that, acknowledging your pain without drowning in it. Because denial doesn't help. Pretending you're fine when you're not only pushes the pain deeper, but wallowing in it, giving it free rein to narrate your life. That's a betrayal of your potential. That's handing over the pen when you should be the one writing. So you grieve, yes. You cry if you need to. You scream into the void if it helps. But then you get back up. You decide deliberately that you are more than what this moment tells you. You draw a line between what's happening around you and the truth of who you are. And here's the truth. You are a human being with immense capacity for growth, meaning, and connection. The fact that someone hasn't seen that yet doesn't mean it isn't there. This is where it gets powerful, when you refuse to let the temporary state of being unloved turn into a permanent state of being unlovable. Because once you believe that lie, you start sabotaging yourself. You stop showing up. You stop offering your gifts. You push people away before they can leave. And worst of all, you stop loving yourself. You become the one who rejects you first. But here's the pivot. You look at yourself in that mirror and say, no more, not in some cheesy surface-level way. I'm talking about real commitment to truth. The truth that feelings are not facts. The truth that your story isn't over. The truth that your value does not disappear because someone else failed to recognize it. Let me tell you something. You were not born to be defined by who did or didn't love you. You were born to become someone who can stand in the fire of rejection and emerge with your soul intact. You were born to confront your pain honestly, without shame, and still walk forward. There is a kind of redemption in doing that, a quiet power. You stop being a victim of circumstance and start becoming the author of your own transformation. You don't ignore the loneliness. You face it. You don't pretend you don't care. You admit that you do, but you keep going. You hold the pain without letting it hold you. And maybe, just maybe, the moment you stop waiting for love to find you and start loving yourself in action, in discipline, in integrity, that's when the right kind of love starts to recognize you. Because love follows truth. And when you stand in truth, even when it hurts, love will eventually find its way to you. But for now you stand. And you say, I feel unloved, but I refuse to believe I am unlovable. It's one of the hardest lessons you'll ever learn, that being rejected by a person, a group, or even by life itself does not mean you're worthless. And yet, that's the trap so many people fall into. They confuse someone else's inability to love them with their own lack of value. They get ghosted, overlooked, dismissed, betrayed, and they internalize it. If they walked away, there must be something wrong with me. That's the story that starts looping in the back of their mind. But just because someone doesn't see your worth doesn't mean you don't have any. It means they were never the one qualified to judge it in the first place. Rejection hurts because it pokes at something primal in us. We're wired for connection. We long to belong. And when we're cut off, when someone we cared about chooses to look the other way, it activates a kind of panic. An emotional siren that screams, "Fix this. Prove yourself. Win them back." But here's the truth you have to face, and it's a brutal one sometimes. People walk away not because you failed, but because they were never ready to see you clearly. Their leaving says more about them than it does about you. But what do most people do? They chase, they beg, they twist themselves into versions they think will be loved. They lower their standards, they silence their needs. And with each compromise, with every act of self-abandonment, they hope, maybe this time love will stay, maybe this time I'll be enough. But that's a lie. Because the second you start changing yourself to be loved by someone else, you've already agreed to one terrible condition, that who you truly are isn't lovable, and once that seed is planted, it grows fast. That's how you lose yourself. Not in one big moment, but in 100 small ones. Biting your tongue when you should have spoken. Laughing when you didn't find it funny. Pretending you're fine when your heart is breaking. You give away pieces of yourself for the illusion of closeness, and in the end, you're left with nothing but regret and a stranger in the mirror. You have to make a choice. You either let rejection define you, or you let it refine you. You either keep believing that being unloved means being unworthy, or you take a long, hard look in the mirror and say, "I am not for everyone, and that's okay." Because being valuable doesn't mean being universally accepted. Gold is still gold, even when someone mistakes it for scrap. And your soul, your heart, your character, your potential, that's gold. But you'll never feel that way if you keep handing the measuring stick to people who can't even measure their own lives properly. Think about this for a second. Why would you let someone who couldn't stay, someone who couldn't show up, someone who couldn't love you properly, why would you let them be the one who decides what you're worth? That's insanity. That's like letting a blind man critique a painting. It's not just unfair, it's irrelevant. When rejection hits, it's not the end, it's a redirect. A cosmic no that clears the path for something better. But you'll only see that if you stop taking it personally, and that takes maturity. It takes self-awareness. It takes strength, because it's so much easier to say, "It's me. I'm the problem. I'm broken." But that's a shortcut to despair. The longer road, the one worth walking, is the path of discernment. Asking, "What can I learn from this?" instead of, "What's wrong with me?" Maybe you loved someone who wasn't capable of receiving it. Maybe you outgrew a version of yourself they were comfortable with. Maybe they left because they couldn't handle your honesty, your ambition, your depth. You'll never know the full story, and you don't need to. What matters is the one truth you can stand on: your worth isn't up for negotiation. The moment you separate rejection from your self-worth, you start living free. You stop walking on eggshells. You stop apologizing for having needs. You stop begging for scraps when you were made for a feast. You stop proving and start becoming. Because the goal isn't to be liked by everyone. The goal is to become someone you respect. And once you do that, the right people, the ones who can meet you in that space of truth and wholeness, they show up. Not because you chased them, but because you finally stood still long enough to be seen by the right eyes. You don't need to be chosen by someone else to validate your existence. You need to choose you, every day, especially on the days when you feel unwanted. That's when it counts the most. That's when the real work begins. Not in proving your worth, but in remembering it. Because someone's rejection is not your verdict. It's their limitation. When you feel unloved, when that hollowness creeps in and starts whispering lies into your ear, the first instinct for a lot of people is to let things fall apart. They let their routines go. They stop caring for themselves, they drift. And I understand that urge. It's seductive. When the world feels cold, when affection dries up, And when no one seems to notice you anymore, it's tempting to slide into a kind of quiet despair. You tell yourself, "What's the point?" So you sleep too much, you skip meals or overeat, you isolate, you stop showing up for your life. But that's exactly when you need structure the most. That's when discipline becomes your lifeline, not because it solves the emotional wound immediately, but because it gives you a place to stand while the storm passes. And it will pass. But not if you're drowning in your own passivity. You see, feelings are important, but they can also be deceiving. They can scream things that aren't true. They can convince you to treat yourself like an afterthought just because someone else did. And when you lose love, especially the kind you had invested your identity in, there's often a collapse, a kind of spiritual vacuum. But if you don't act, if you don't impose some kind of order on the chaos, that vacuum fills up with self-destruction. That's why I tell people, start small, make your bed, clean your room, go outside and walk for 20 minutes, even if your body feels like dead weight. Get back into your rhythm, reclaim your time. Because when you don't, you leave the door open for the void to move in and take over your life. There's something incredibly healing about routine, not because it numbs your emotions, but because it grounds them. You're not denying the pain by brushing your teeth and showing up for work. You're telling the pain, "You don't run this house. I do." That's the difference between someone who is broken and someone who is building. The broken person lets pain run the show. The builder says, "You can stay, but I'm still showing up. I've got things to do." That's not cold. That's not avoidance. That's strength. It's integrity. It's choosing not to betray yourself just because someone else failed to love you the way you deserved. It's telling your future self, "I didn't give up on you even when I wanted to." What people don't realize is that your habits, your daily rituals, they shape the identity you live in. And when you feel unloved, your sense of self gets foggy. You don't recognize yourself anymore. You look in the mirror and think, "Who is this?" But that's not permanent. That's not fate. You get to rebuild brick by brick. And structure is how you start. You don't need motivation. That's another lie. Motivation is a mood, and moods come and go. What you need is a non-negotiable decision. You say to yourself, every morning, I get up at 7. I stretch, I drink water, I make my space clean. That's not for show. That's an act of self-respect, even if no one else is watching. Especially if no one else is watching. When you don't feel loved, you have to be the one who chooses to love yourself through action. Not through empty affirmations or coddling, but through effort, through care, through consistency. You take yourself seriously. You respect your time. You create momentum where there was only stillness before. And it's not just about productivity. This isn't about grinding your emotions into the ground or pretending everything's fine. It's about proving to yourself, through repetition, that you are not helpless. You are not at the mercy of other people's affections. You are capable of building a life worth living, one routine at a time. There's this lie that says healing has to be emotional, dramatic, deep. But often it's mechanical. Healing can look like doing the dishes, going to the gym, writing down a list of goals and checking one off. It's choosing to treat yourself like someone worth the effort, even when it doesn't feel like it. And over time you start to change. Not overnight, but little by little you reclaim your dignity. You start walking taller. You begin to respect the person you see in the mirror, not because they're perfect, but because they didn't give up. Because they kept going. Because they built a scaffold out of structure when everything else was falling apart. And that's when things start to shift. That's when the world begins to respond to you differently. Not because your pain vanished, but because your posture changed. Your actions began to speak a new truth. I am not disposable. I am not a victim. I am still here. And that alone, that is power. When you feel unloved, there's a tendency to turn outward, to search desperately for someone to fix it, to notice you, to choose you, to fill the void. But that pursuit, that hunger for external validation, will leave you running in circles. Because as long as your worth is tied to someone else's approval, you'll always be one cold shoulder away from collapse. There's a better path. A harder one, yes, but one that leads somewhere real. And it starts with this simple, brutal question: do you respect yourself? Not admire in theory. Not pretend to in front of others. I mean deep down, when no one's watching, do you respect who you are becoming? Because here's what I've learned: respect always comes before love. If you don't become someone you respect, you'll never believe you're truly worthy of the love you crave. Even if it shows up, you'll sabotage it, push it away, or question it constantly. Why? Because on some level, you don't believe you've earned it. Now don't get me wrong. I'm not saying love is transactional. But there is a kind of inner trust you have to build with yourself, a sense that you are walking in alignment with your own values, that you're not lying to yourself, not cheating your potential, not drifting through life on autopilot. That's what creates real confidence, not arrogance but peace. And peace is magnetic. When you become someone you respect, everything changes. Your energy changes, your standards rise. You stop chasing people who don't value you, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You no longer beg to be seen, because you see yourself. You no longer manipulate or shrink, because you know who you are. And the truth is, you can't fake that. People can smell self-betrayal. They can sense when you're performing instead of living from a place of integrity. So what does it actually mean to become someone you respect? It's not about being perfect. It's not about achieving everything on some glorified checklist. It's about showing up as someone who's honest, disciplined, accountable. Someone who tells the truth even when it's hard. Someone who does what they say they'll do. Someone who keeps moving forward even when it hurts. That's strength. That's character. It means facing the parts of you that are weak and not just judging them, but strengthening them. It means asking, where am I compromising who I could be for the comfort of who I've been? It's not about guilt. It's about ownership. You start living like your choices matter, because they do. Every decision you make either builds the person you want to become or buries them further. And the more you build, the more grounded you become. You don't need people to love you in order to feel okay anymore. You're not operating from a deficit. You're full, and from that place you give, not to prove your worth, but because it's who you are. You stop being a consumer of love and become a contributor of it. Not everyone will understand that shift. That's fine. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to become someone you can look in the mirror and respect. Sometimes the most painful moments, the breakups, the betrayals, the silence, are the wake-up calls. They force you to realize that you've been outsourcing too much of your identity, that you've been living in response to other people instead of in alignment with your own values. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You either go back to sleep or you start the real work. This is where it turns. You stop asking, why doesn't she love me? And you start asking, am I being the man or the woman I was meant to be? You stop spiraling over who left, and you start showing up for the version of you that you abandoned. That's the one who needs you now. That's the one who's waiting. So you make the changes. You stop hiding. You face your addictions, your distractions, your fears. You level up, not for them, not for applause, but for the person staring back at you every morning. You want to feel loved. Start with earning your own respect. Every time you follow through, every time you make the hard choice, every time you say no to what's easy and yes to what's right, you are telling yourself, I matter. And slowly it starts to feel real. Not because someone else affirmed it, not because the world gave you a trophy, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. That's the moment everything begins to shift. With a loss, when you feel unloved, the world can start to look grey. You stop seeing beauty. You stop believing in your own capacity to give anything meaningful. With a loss, instinct is to shrink, to withdraw, to guard your energy and hold on to whatever scraps of dignity you think you have left. And I get it. When your heart's been shattered, the last thing you want to do is offer it again. Why contribute to a world that hasn't shown up for you? Why extend a hand when yours has only been left hanging? But here's what most people miss. It's exactly in that moment, when you feel least seen, least valued, that your contribution matters most. Not because you're trying to win anyone over, not because you're looking to prove something, but because choosing to give when you feel empty is a quiet act of defiance against the pain. It's you standing up and saying, I may not feel loved right now, but I still choose to be loving. That's not weakness. That's not denial. That's power. That's you reclaiming agency over your experience. Because what's the alternative? Bitterness, isolation, becoming someone who withholds everything until life hands you what you think you deserve. With a loss, that's a losing game. That's handing the pain control over your behavior, and you're better than that. You have to understand something. To the loss contribution is not about having something to give. It's about becoming someone who gives anyway. Begins with a loss. That's the difference between a person who is consumed by their wounds and a person who grows through them. You could be heartbroken, you could be in the darkest chapter of your life, and still you can create something beautiful. A kind word, a helping hand, a piece of art, a commitment to something bigger than your current suffering. And it's not just for others, it's for you. Every time you give, authentically, from a place of choice, not desperation, you remind yourself that you're still here, that you still have power, that you still have value, not because someone else confirmed it, but because you acted as if it were true. That kind of integrity can carry you through the worst storms. People think love is only something you receive, but love is something you generate. It's something you create with your attention, your words, your effort. And when you choose to do that, even in pain, you're not just being noble, you're keeping your heart alive. Because if you stop giving, if you let yourself close off completely, that's when the real damage happens. That's when you start believing the lie that you're just a void, that you have nothing left. But you always have something left. Always. Maybe you're not ready to build a relationship again. Fine, with a loss. Maybe you're not ready to be vulnerable with people who've hurt you. Understandable. But don't let that stop you from being a force of goodness in the world. There are people right now who need what only you can offer. Your insight, your creativity, your presence. Not because you're perfect, but because you've suffered and you didn't let it turn you into a ghost. You have to decide, will I let the absence of love make me cold? Or will I use it as a fire to light something new? Because if all you do is wait, to be chosen, to be understood, to be wanted, you put your future in someone else's hands. But when you choose to contribute anyway, you stop waiting and you start becoming. With a loss, it's not about pretending everything is okay. It's not about masking your pain with productivity. It's about recognizing that love is an action, not just a feeling. And you are still capable of that action. You can be the reason someone else doesn't give up today. Begins with a loss. You can be the voice that breaks someone else's silence. You can be the hands that build something lasting, even when your heart is still in recovery. And what happens over time is something subtle and profound. You start to reconnect to your own life. You begin to feel useful again, not in a way that depends on applause, but in a way that affirms your existence. You remember who you are beneath the pain, not a victim, not a reject, a contributor, a person who chose to keep giving even when it hurt. That's the beginning of transformation. That's how the soul heals. Not by being pitied, but by being engaged, by offering something to the world, even if all you have today is a whisper. So don't wait until you feel full to start pouring out. Because sometimes, pouring out is exactly how you begin to fill back up. There comes a point, after the silence, after the rejection, after the long nights of feeling invisible, when you have to make a decision, a quiet, soul-defining decision. And it's not about getting back at anyone. It's a loss. It's not about becoming cold or unfeeling. It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, I'm done letting the absence of love control how I show up in this world. You stop waiting to be chosen. You stop living your life in response to who stayed and who left. And you start moving forward, not out of anger, but out of truth. Because the truth is, it begins with a loss. You don't need to stay stuck in the story where you were overlooked. You don't need to keep rereading that same chapter with a loss, trying to find the moment where it all went wrong. Maybe you'll never get closure. Maybe they'll never explain. With a loss, maybe they didn't even realize what they did to you. But at some point, you have to stop bleeding over people who aren't even aware they cut you. At some point, your healing becomes your responsibility, even if your wounds weren't your fault. That doesn't mean you erase your feelings. You honor them. Begins with a loss. You let yourself grieve. You let yourself feel the full weight of what it meant to be unseen, unheard, unloved. But you don't set up camp there. With a loss, you don't keep feeding your energy into a place that only takes from you. Because there's a life ahead of you, and it's waiting for you to show up. not as a shadow of who you were, but as a stronger, wiser version who learned how to turn pain into purpose. Letting go isn't forgetting. It's not pretending like it didn't matter. It did matter. What you felt was real. But letting go is about choosing to no longer allow that pain to dictate your identity. You are not what they couldn't love. You are not defined by who couldn't stay. And just because someone failed to value you doesn't mean you were any less valuable. With a loss, some people just don't have the capacity to meet you where you are. That doesn't diminish your worth. That reveals their limitation. And once you really accept that, something shifts. You stop reaching backwards. You stop hoping they'll wake up and realize what they lost with a loss. Because you're too focused on becoming someone who doesn't need to be found. You're already found by yourself. And when you find yourself again, after losing so much, you begin to move with a different kind of grace, a quiet power. Not loud, not boastful, but rooted. With a loss, you become unshakable. Not because you never feel hurt again, but because you finally trust yourself enough to keep walking. Begins with a loss. You're no longer paralyzed by who doesn't clap, who doesn't respond, who doesn't care. With a loss, you've learned that your life doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition. You breathe easier, you stand taller. Begins with a loss. You stop begging for closure from people who wouldn't even know what to do with your honesty. And here's what's incredible. Once you truly let go, you create space. Space for new connections. Space for real alignment. Space for peace. Because as long as you're carrying that old weight, you're not open. You're guarded. You're waiting for the past to explain itself. And healing doesn't come in that waiting. It comes in the release. So, you stop rehearsing the conversations that never happened. You stop checking in on people who stopped checking in on you. You stop defining your present by the damage of your past, and you start living. You show up for the sunrise. You start building again. You start believing again. Slowly, quietly, you come back to life. Not the life where everything is perfect. With a loss, not the life you imagined when you thought they'd still be by your side, but a real life, a grounded one. One where you are the one holding the pen, writing the next chapter. And maybe, just maybe, it turns out better than you thought. Not because it's pain-free, but because it's real. Because you built it. Not on illusion, not on what-ifs, but on truth. On resilience. On choice. That's the gift of letting go. You take back your time. You take back your power. And you start walking, not away from something, but towards something. Toward peace. Toward purpose. Toward the version of you that was buried under all that waiting. So stop looking back. You've seen enough. Start looking forward. There's more life to live, and it's waiting for you to show up.